Hi everyone, we're here today with Sandy Jimenez, the creator of Marley Davidson, Bronx Exorcist, and Sit House Poet, which was um, part of his work that was published in World War III Illustrated. I have the last issue right here, the war we are fighting for. And well, I think it's a good day to talk about this dance because with the election and finally there's not an openly fascist person running the USA as we hope, as we have learned, right, like some moments before. And I think it's also a good moment to start the show reminding everyone that there's a lot of work to do and there's a lot of stuff that we need to keep doing. And I'm not from the USA, so I have other stuff to keep doing from here, but we all have to support each other. And I always start the shows reminding of the Black Lives Matter movement because it's still going, even if it doesn't have the, media coverage that it has usually. And I want to start this one also reminding people of look at blacklivesmatter.car.co. It's easy to find in the internet. It's easy to find ways to help, what happens in your city, what happens near you, etc. And once that's said, let's start with Sandy Jimenez. And I'm gonna share some of his work while we deep dive into what he's trying to say. So here we have from World War III Illustrated, God Bless the Americans was as comic strip that had a lot of things that this was the cover. And well, first I want to ask you about how do you relate the things you do. First, let's talk about to the war in general, to the things you see around you, and then we're gonna go back to the beginning and to other more otherworldly stuff. Terms, so it's also great to talk about.
Sure. I mean, stories like this one in particular, they're generally, I know that I have sort of an idea for a story when it's something I can't forget or something that keeps running in my mind. It might be a memory or an image. And, in this case, it was this sort of recurring cycle of anti-Chinese sentiment. I, believe it or not, wrote this story before COVID and before everything that happened this year. I pitched this story to Seth Tabachman, who you interviewed recently, who's our founder and editor over at World War III, along with Peter Cooper. And I grew up with a couple of kids of Asian descent in the Bronx, and I was seeing this upswell like late last year. That's this very cyclical thing that has happened in my lifetime during particularly Republican presidencies, and it usually has to do with international trade. But it sort of, whether it's foreign cars becoming more prevalent when I was younger in the 80s, and it was originally going to be this sort of story of that prism through this automotive school where I worked at part-time, and just showing how for me what's really interesting to write about is the racism we don't talk about, with the bigotry we don't talk about, and that's the bigotry that we ourselves have. It's very easy to point to, particularly right now in the United States, these sort of bizarre crypto-fascist groups, whether it's the Proud Boys or whoever. But within our own lives and within our own families, myself being of Hispanic descent, there's a tremendous amount of colonialist oppression that's just naturally part of our culture. It plays out in very strange ways, how people talk about their hair, how people talk about skin color and class. And, I just thought I needed to tell a story about that within Trump's America because, now as of today, thank God, it looks like he's definitely going to be gone, but we still have problems. He's really sort of, I won't say that he isn't a very potent and dangerous actor on his own, but he's not possible without the problems we already have that we don't address, that we don't talk about. And one of them is the fact that just racism is very, very well stitched and embroidered into our culture in a way that we often don't like to recognize. And it cuts across all things. It sort of undermines everything. Um, so that's kind of where this story came from, and I wanted to show, how it hurts and affects everyone, basically. So
I think we're gonna go back full circle to this story at the end.
sure.
And now I wanna show some of your work, because aside from this work, which is more realistic, more rooted in day-to-day life, you started doing work that was more like supernatural. Well, you started with this also, but parallel with supernatural work in Marley Davidson. Oh, it's not certain. I knew that could happen in a moment. We're having some technical issues, but they're legal. Okay, so you started doing Marley Davidson, Bronx Exorcist. That was a reflection onto some themes like vampire, zombies. There's a lot of imaginary related to horror, to supernatural. But in fact, when I look at it, I don't see that different from your other work, because it's trying to make criticism of seeing things too simple, are not trying to, well, point out things that are more nuanced in how we relate to things, in how we take part on things that we consider ugly, or how we can fix that, looking at ourselves, something like that. I thought was going on in Marley Davidson. And I want to ask you that. Will I get to serve that?
Yeah, Marley was my response to a few things. In the 80s when I was a kid, and in high school, the X-Men, of course, were like the comic. It was Chris Claremont and John Byrne that run up to Dark Phoenix and all that. And, that sort of metaphor of mutants as outsiders was very potent to me as someone who's Hispanic. It's a pretty open allegory about race. I mean, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, never explicitly said that it was about Malcolm X and, Martin Luther King, but it's pretty obvious that that's who Magneto is and that's who Professor X is. One is assimilationist and one is not. One is violent and one is not. I mean, they were in their 40s when they created that, in their mid 40s. Jack Kirby might have been older. They were clearly men of their time. And I felt like comics were losing a lot of that really potent allegory. For me, monsters and horror fiction has always been political. It's always been, about sexual politics, about class politics. I mean, when you look at what Dracula is, in Bram Stoker's creation of it, first of all, it's a very xenophobic, sort of take on the vampire legend, right? It's this foreigner coming to London and he's buying land and he's sort of taking over Carfax Abbey and he's buying all these places. I mean, the story of Dracula begins with a real estate deal. He has this solicitor come out to do his paperwork, sort of psychologically destroys him, and then just gets another guy to continue his work. And the idea that he has to bring Earth from his own country into this other country, I mean, it sort of speaks to so much of the xenophobia that was prevalent, in the late 18th century and late 19th century and early 20th century in England. And frankly, in all sort of port cities around the world, there's always that dynamic. So, the fact that the Count is someone who lives up on a hill, collects taxes, bleeds the peasantry, like all of those things are very political to me. So, when I did Marley Davidson, I wanted to get back to those kinds of supernatural roots because I think they're very political. I think that when they started doing a lot of horror in comics in the 90s, they started going to these sort of scientific explanations, and they became more closely related to the superhero comics. And to me, it was more interesting to keep them distinct. And having grown up in the South Bronx, where there has been no shortage of exploitation with regards to real estate, burning people out of buildings, to me, it was interesting to create these vampires who were basically the mafia, who were responsible for a lot of this oppression. So that's sort of the thing that threads through Marley Davidson. There's also a lot of race politic that I always wanted to explore with regards to supernatural and horror fiction. You know, the Lord of the Rings was always, you know, I think for a lot of people of my generation, and certainly afterwards with these movies now in the last 20 years, they're very, very potent foundation myths, you know, for that try to explain the formation of England. But, you know, I think again, to outsiders like, you know, you and I, there's always a misbegotten population in these stories. And they're uniform, they're indistinct, and they're just there to be overcome. And in the Lord of the Rings, it's the orcs, right? They're ugly, they're evil. And what I wanted to do with Marley Davidson was tell the story of what happens after those stories, right? Because in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, when the war is over, the ground swallows up the opposing troops. It's like the most convenient thing. It's so ridiculous. Like, I've always thought that what would happen after that war is now the orcs are there and this war is over and they need jobs and they're going to start coming into towns and they're going to have their own little ghetto in the town and they're going to be mistreated and they're going to try and get political representation and they're going to start to intermarry and there's going to be half orc people and we're going to see the same crap that happens in every country since there have been countries, you know. And that to me, you know, it's interesting. Whenever I would talk about that stuff with editors, they'd go, that's too complicated. I'm like, that's where the really interesting story is. That's where the relevant story is, making this stuff political and getting into, you know, for me, growing up in New York, the eternal question was, you know, what do Jews do when they see a vampire? You know, they can't use a crucifix. That's an interesting wrinkle to me. Like, you have to answer that question. You know, that if this is a monster that's terrified of, you know, godly holy faith, Muslims and Jews would have some other artifact to use, whether it's a Star of David or the Quran. But it can't be that this monster is only afraid of crucifixes. That doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense if you think that Christianity is the only thing that's worth anything in the world. So right there implicit in that myth is this whole collision of vectors of politics and race and creed and bigotry. And that's the stuff I wanted to throw into Marley Davidson. So that's my long answer to your very short, direct question. I'm sorry.
No, it was great. And I think it's great what it does with the religious politics, because it has you know, representatives from different religions in the comics, and that's nice because it's not usual in horror comics. They're usually very directed, obviously, towards Christianity,
yeah,
and that's great.
Well, it fascinates me, right? I mean, again, that's they would always tell me like, well, no, you can't. Why would a rabbi be in the story? I'm like, well, why wouldn't he? Because there are rabbis everywhere, and you know, I don't think that Dracula would stick to one neighborhood or one country. Right? It's like once you start unraveling it, you know, they get mad because you're assailing something canonical, right? But again, that's where, if you want to tell new interesting stories, that's where the interesting stuff is. You know, I found it so interesting, like the backlash against the Twilight movies. You know, they're not really for me. You know, they're really more for sort of teenagers and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But you know, they're trying to make them relevant for somebody. You know, they're trying, and I was like, there's no problem with that. Who cares? Like, it's not like it destroys this other narrow version of the thing you like. But people were like, you know, going to conventions and like protesting. It was like the dumbest thing I'd ever seen. It's like, they're movies, and if you don't like them, don't go see them. You know, to the extent that they answer questions and provide metaphors for somebody, they're vital. They're important. You know. But that argument's been going on since Anne Rice wrote, you know, Interview with
a Vampire.
Did not want Dracula sexualized, which is crazy because that's been old since Bela Lugosi, you know, since Christopher Lee, since all of those actors played those parts. Those guys were. It's hard to see it from our vantage point today because movie stars look so different. But you know, Bela Lugosi was a red hot superstar, like. When he did that role, he was a sex symbol when he did that role. That's what sold that picture. We just think of the funny Hungarian accent today, and it's been parodied so much that we've lost sort of what the original context was. But, you know, him, Langella, everyone who's played it afterwards, even in the so-called canonical treatments of the story, it's super sexualized, you know.
I have I don't know if not an issue, but I have some interest in that, in exploring why the sexualization of that. And I don't know, there has been a lot of answers to that. That's also an interesting point of vampires, like why we sexualize them.
Yeah, I think, it has to do with power. It
Hmm,
obviously has to do with gender. These are characters that are very fluid, right? They can, change form as they are accustomed to. They appear to the objects of their affection in different forms and different guises. And
hmm,
I think that's something that's very compelling to people in a way that they're not often able to be open about, right? Because we
hmm,
live still in Western culture in this very rigid society that's very binary, that's very
hmm,
much about assignments. And, thankfully, that is at least an open conversation now. But I will tell you, when I was young in the 80s, I marched with ACT UP, here in New York. And
hmm,
even among the culture of sort of gay men in the city, as a straight man, it was interesting to me that they were very aggressively separatist with regards to like trans people and
hmm.
the drag community, because they thought that those people were not quote unquote serious,
Yes.
which
Hmm,
was remarkable to me. It just didn't. I was like, you're all getting beat up, like you're all under attack. Like the people who don't like you don't compartmentalize you that way. They see
hmm,
you as unilaterally something that has to be wiped out, and therefore you should, have some sympathy towards each other and see each other as one. And certainly, I thought as a young man, if I could do that, I just didn't see what the problem was. And then, as I got to know people, you get into the nuances of what these things are about, and it always comes down to insecurities and fears. And one group thinks that maybe they'll be more accepted if only they can shove this group aside. It happens in race politics too, right? It's people, Hispanics move to this country, and within a generation or two, if they're light skinned enough, they can quote unquote become white. But
hmm,
their cousins or other people in their family who maybe have more, their African descent is more visible in their appearance, can never matriculate that way. And you find people putting, distance between themselves and people who are basically their own family in order to quote unquote get ahead, or because they think it'll benefit them somehow. And that plays out in just so many dynamic ways. So getting back to the subject of monsters, the term monster really means in the biblical sense something out of the natural order, right? So who's a monster? And
hmm.
that's political. To call someone a monster is a very political thing. And it's something that in the 4 issues I did a world of Marley Davidson, I haven't quite gotten to it yet because it's a very sort of involved thing. And I tell these sort of vignettes. So I want to sort of do shorter stories with him in the future so I can get to some of these topics. But that notion of nomenclature and what when you call someone unnatural, that's a very powerful thing. And it's not a new thing. It's not something out of as great as the X-Men has been about that discourse. That is something that's been part of our politic, probably going back to when we were in caves. I don't know. It's just it's always such a useful thing to someone who wants power to say to them, these guys are out. These people are not us. It's almost as basic as that. So,
I think this connects really with my next question that I want to make about Marley Davidson, which was, I think I just put this theme in which a little spoiler. I'm not gonna do a lot of spoilers because you all would get these comics. I hope we get them soon, restated. But Marley like gets to this idea of killing like every vampire he can, and it turns that when you kill a vampire, they're I don't know how to call them, but the vampires that they have converted turn into humans. So he ends up killing a human, and there's this thing that really shows that this human wasn't really a great person, maybe because of his relationship with vampirism or something like that. So someone is glad that they died, but it's still uncomfortable to see. It's still uncomfortable to tackle down.
and
And I want to. Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, no, I want to end this question with like comparing to the next issue, which gets into zombies that prefer vampires for some reason and how this affects the vampires. And it's a whole issue of Marley questioning if he should just let it go and don't kill the zombies or something like that. And I think it touches in the same uh, moral questions about how you dehumanize others that finally, for me, get more complex as the book goes. And I just want to show some art before you answer to this kind of reflection question, which is
Sure.
about the for issue, which gets into some more abstract, some more uh, ritualistic art, because it's trying to for me what I felt reading it is like it was trying to get into these complexes when I was like doing it more complex so that the relationships Marley has to this are not good or bad. They're about change. And I don't know, something along those lines.
Yeah, Marley's a zealot, and I wanted to tell the story about a zealot because I thought there were so many heroes. I was really disturbed about the rise in popularity of characters like the Punisher in the 90s. I thought it was just a crazy idea to put forth in fiction. This guy like just kills people and never makes mistakes, and to me that's just a very dangerous idea. And Marley is a very dangerous character. One of the things I try to highlight in my work, whether it's the stuff I do in World War III Illustrated or in Marley Davidson, is that there's a difference between a hero and a protagonist. And a hero may not necessarily, to my mind, maybe they don't exist. Maybe there isn't such a thing as such a noble bearing person who's right and can be dependable that way. Maybe there isn't, a Clark Kent out there that can turn into a Superman, right? When you think about it, Superman's real power is that he's decent, because the rest of us would probably be terrible people if we had those abilities. We would not be able to sort of resist the temptation to, cut corners and whatever else. But with regards to Marley and sort of his war on the undead, what he does in that first issue is actually exceptionally cruel. And they didn't want to lay it out. I wanted people to sort of be able to read into it on their own, which I'm glad you did. And the thing is, that ledger that he has, I'm sort of using a canonical vampiric trope, which is that there's a vampire that sort of starts the curse, and then it's almost like a family tree that just keeps growing while they like infect these people. And if you knock off the head vampire, sort of the curse is broken, but you still have these people. Now in Marley's case, he doesn't know how many of these people were unwilling, who did what. And that's sort of the question that Samir Hudson is raising. He's saying like, this guy's a man, like we live in a society of rules. Perhaps you shouldn't be just sanctioning him. This isn't about stopping a curse anymore or protecting, ostensibly thousands of people across many years. He can't do any of that kind of damage anymore. And to also show how other people would be complicit in that. That shopkeeper is very happy that guy got his head blown off. And, I don't spell that out for the reader because I know what my answer is. And, I don't think that should be the reader's answer. I have to pose a problem to them so that they can see into this world a little more fully. And that's really what that's about. With regards to the second story, which is sort of like, I try to present Marley with easy solutions that kind of fall apart, right? There's this sort of weird, I don't know what you'd call it, like a conspiracy between this sort of like Luciferian church, the Satanic church, and this local Catholic group of businesses, which to me is just a very American thing. I'm sure people get really offended when they read it, but to me that's like, that's no different than Democrats and the Republicans here in the United States, basically conspiring to do very terrible things in the name of commerce or in the name of public security, like what happened with the Patriot Act here in the United States. And in the end, it's another situation where Marley has to really decide what is the real meaning behind the violence that he's engaging in. Is he really trying to protect people at this point? Or is he trying to solve a problem? Is he doing it the most efficient way possible? And it's about sort of the limits of violence and power in this fictional world of horror, really. Um, the last story that you read, which is the fourth one, probably sort of jumps out into another direction because I was trying to set up a bunch of things. I thought I was going to get to the next issue very quickly after that, and I didn't get to. Because there's a backstory with Anna von Bayer, who's the sort of love interest who threads through it, who disappears in that story. They find her again, and the whole thing. It's also, I felt like I finally had to do a story where he actually performed an exorcism, because it was 4 issues in and he was just blasting people's heads off. So I had to do an actual exorcism underwater. I actually wrote to the Vatican and got a copy of the Roman ritual. They actually mailed it to me, which was incredible. I got them on the phone and they were like, "Why do you want this?" And I was like, "I draw comics." And they were like, "Oh, of course." And they sent it to me. And it's in Latin. It's not in English. And basically the black text is what you're supposed to be saying. And then there's red text in the corners, which is what you're supposed to be doing, like smacking the person or hitting them with holy water. And it's tiny, like I grew up, The Exorcist is one of my favorite films. I think it's the greatest horror film ever made. But, in it, Max von Sydow says to Jason Miller, "Get me the Roman ritual, the big one." And it's like the size of a phone book. The Rite of Exorcism is it's like this. It's like tiny. It's like a menu. It's maybe like 60 pages. And it's apparently been, the version I have is expanded, like the one they did in 98 or 99 after whatever meeting of the Vatican where they, I guess, got rid of some of the nuttier stuff in it. But it's a tiny book. It's like this. It's just, I was expecting to get this thing with a lock on it, it doesn't compare favorably with the book and, the Evil Dead movies. It's very tiny.
So we got a couple of comments. One was saying that it would be great to see that continuation of the Lord of the Rings doing, people getting jobs, the orcs getting jobs, and mixing. That it would be a good derivative work.
There's an image I wanted to send you, and I can't find it. I never got to scan it, but I did this very articulated drawing of a troll by the side of the road holding up a sign that says, "Veteran of Middle Earth Wars, will work for food." They would be the new homeless people. They would be this, or they would, sort of make it in as immigrant classes in certain places and be very visible. But they wouldn't just disappear into the ground. I think that's what a lot of people hope immigrants will do, or hope that veterans will do after the war doesn't work out. The ground will just open up and close them up. And again, it's funny. I was watching for that when I saw Return of the King, because that's kind of what happens in the animated version they did, and that's kind of what they say. It's not so explicit in the book, but it's kind of like the every director has come to the conclusion that it's like, okay, the ground's just swallowed them up, because I don't know what I would do with these people in a narrative. They can't just be running around, making, culture and making demands and, asking for fair wages and housing and healthcare, so. But that's interesting, right? I mean, to me, that's more interesting than telling a story where they disappear.
And the other comment was just they love the distinction between heroes and protagonists as distinct things. Nothing to comment for me on that. I love it too. And well, let's get to some of your other work. Well, we're starting getting more into your social commentary work. This is social commentary too, but the social commentary that does it with real people and directly. And for me, there's a connection between the two, because you were doing an animated series for Marley Davidson, and for me, in my head, that connected pretty well with a comic that you did that I'm gonna share now. Okay, on I hope it's saying right. Okay, on photography, and it was. I don't want to spoil it to anyone, because it's really gets deep into what people do when they do photography and how they could do it really wrong. And I don't want to spoil that part too much,
I,
but I feel. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I can talk a bit about the background that led to the story, and that will not
Hmm.
spoil it for anybody. But
Yes, I
okay,
think that. Okay,
yeah, go
head.
ahead. Um, when I was a kid, I growing up in the South Bronx, it was extremely depopulated. I mean, it looked like Dresden after the bombing. Like it was just ridiculous. Like the building my mother and I lived in on 172nd Street and Vice, for anyone who knows sort of New York City and knows the Bronx, we were the only populated building for like 8 blocks around. Like everything was just gone. So a lot of art students would sort of like come in off buses and like take pictures of the area, because it was so gothic and so exotic. But it's like, we fucking live there. So we're just sort of standing around. And one day this kid was taking pictures of me, and I didn't think anything of it. I was just on my bicycle riding around. And we had a sort of local lunatic, this kid named Fabiano, who was he was half Italian and half black. He had like this bright red afro. He looked insane. He was just like a wonderful sort of older kid who was always working on weird stuff. He was always like building go-karts and stuff. But he walked up to me after that kid took my picture, and he was like, "Don't let those kids take your picture." And I was like, "Why?" And he says, "You ever seen National Geographic? Those covers of those Africans, that's what those people are trying to do to you." And it didn't click at the time. It was just this thing sort of in the back of my mind. And years later, I had just a really tough time with photography, even though I wanted to do it. And I didn't realize that what was blocking me from doing it was this very problematic relationship I had to representation. The other thing about photography, if you grew up in a place like that, like the one I grew up in, and I think this is the case for people around the world, the interesting thing about the Bronx is, as things got worse, the photography got narrower, right? Like the photographs that families took. So my friend Eloy and I talk about this all the time. When we look at our family albums, the pictures start off like, pretty wide, like people in front of a car or whatever. Then when the fires got really bad and the buildings were disappearing and we just had wasteland behind us, the pictures suddenly become like portraits. Like the camera's always very close. Like people were trying to block out the background, the blight. So it's like every album, for a certain generation that starts in like 1970, maybe it ends around 1985, has this wasteland in the middle of it, where it's like suddenly like, they're like photo booth photos, or most of it's indoors. That's the other thing. You'll notice a lot more indoor photography suddenly from like 1977 to about 1983. And you go from house to house, and it's the same as like, there it is. It's like the rings on a tree stump. Like you just suddenly see the place where the rings get wider, because there was more water or whatever, and then they get thinner. And this story was about a lot of those issues about photography as representation. I'm a filmmaker and an animator, and I had an excellent, excellent teacher who had the worst time with me over at the Cooper Union, named Christine Osinski, who was trying to break through this stuff with me because she just didn't understand why, I was having such trouble, sort of framing things and taking pictures. And I just wasn't mature enough at the time or self-aware enough at the time to explain it to her. And it wasn't until long after that I wrote this story, believe it or not, a very long time ago, and just didn't get to it. It was just too big. At the time, the stories I was doing for World War III Illustrated were in the 5 to 8 page range. And this was a sprawling, just this ridiculous epic that had no structure, as you see. And when I did the story, I just decided, fine, it's not going to have a structure. Like in the middle of it, I'm going to interrupt myself and tell the story the way it should have been told. And, again, hats off to my editors, Ethan Heitner and Seth and all those folks, because they've always been willing to go out on a limb with me when I propose these insane things that, I say them pretty confidently, but at the time I'm talking, I'm really not sure of what, how I'm going to pull this off. And this was, they gave me enough room to move on this one, and it worked out pretty well, I think. I think it lays out the concerns that I had very well, at the very least.
I just remember right now the interview I have with Seth, when he said you were one of the best kept secrets of comics and one of the best writers.
Absolutely. Mhm.
And that's something really sweet to receive from someone who is your editor, I imagine. And
My mentor, I mean, he's the first guy to publish my work, so yeah, it means everything to me to hear him say that, especially since I have been an incredible pain in his ass for 20 years now. I always bring these problematic stories and then I try to get out of them too. Like the last couple of years, I presented the stuff and he's got to like call me on the phone. He's like, no, you have to do this story. You have to finish this. And I try to just get out of it. The story I did on race, skin poisoning, was so.
mm,
That's one of the only things I've ever done in my life that was actually painful to do. I tried to do a live reading of it, and I burst into tears, and have not really. It's not one I like to talk about publicly. It's just too close to, all of these. None of these are straight autobiography. I have to take enormous liberties to tell a story well, but in doing that, and sometimes you actually get closer to the truth than the actual events, will tell, because you're injecting it with so much of your own thought and so much of your own fears. And literally reading the words in that story, some of the words and interactions in it are so ugly and to me very much alive, even though that was, now close to 30 years ago when those events happened. That's an incredibly traumatic story for me. And I really did try to get out of finishing it, and Seth wouldn't let me. So hats off to him.
yeah, that one is on. I don't have scans of that because I have it in physical, but it's on this one.
Oh yes, now the time of monsters.
Now it is the time of monsters. And well, what I do have scans of is skips,
Oh
which
yes.
I think was kind of precursor to that other story. It told a very similar tale in the team, even if the people were completely different and behaved completely different. But
It's the same characters but younger. So
oh,
started
okay.
with a child. The narrator's the same guy. You can never always tell who he is because his eyes are quotation marks.
Yes, that's the one based on you, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, he's sort of my stand-in. And again, I don't like to call these memoirs because, on the one hand, when you say that to a reviewer or to a reader, they're just like, "Oh, a bunch of interesting things happened to you, and you just wrote them down." And there's so much more work involved than that. So I don't like being reduced to being called a memoirist. But also, it's just a little more honest because I do change the orders of things. They just don't. Life on its own is not that meaningful. If it was, we wouldn't have to create art, right? We could just think about what happened that day and that would be it. But in order to make these salient stories for someone like you to read about something that's in my head, I have to, sort of tell it in a way that highlights the things that I think are important. And life doesn't do that for you. Weird things just happen, and you're sort of left to sort them out.
I
But
also have noticed that you have a relationship with these characters from the. I think we're gonna get more to that as we go around, but I wanna just throw it now that you have a relationship to these characters. Like you are self-aware that you are writing them. In the story on Shameless Feminist that we'll talk later more, there's a character that suddenly starts a discussion with your character, but it's for both breaking. Like it's like you
oh
are
yeah,
writing me in that way, and I feel like that discussion with the work shows in the work itself that you are. It's like what you're telling me that you're not writing a story as itself. It's like it's so clear that you make decisions because like even you question those decisions on the page, like some character telling you, yeah, you're writing me in this way, and this is and you answering to that and to why you want to express those questions. That I found that interesting, and I found that in my head, maybe for you not, but in my head, connected with this part of skips that was like, uh, it seems like a very personal and intimate memory of you like reading comics, reading micronauts, if I'm right.
yeah.
Um, While talking about your relationship to Zeus, which is like the sweetest part of this comic, because then it gets more harsh to read, but this is like the sweetest moment. And I don't know, maybe this question is more like, how do you relate with your characters to suddenly put something that feels so much like your memory of reading comics, or something that is like a discussion with a character, like you're putting yourself in there, but not really in there? Like, I don't know, I like that.
I mean, all of it's personal. It really is. I mean, the Marley stuff. Even if you look at the opening page of issue 1, that view is of Freeman Avenue, and everyone my age knows exactly what street that is. It was a notorious, just like fucked up street where just terrible things happen. If you see an old film called Fort Apache, the Bronx, with Paul Newman, it's actually featured in that movie. Even it was such a notorious place. In a thing like this, yeah, I mean, this is very much a memory I remember of just. It's kind of one of the things that just interests me about my childhood, and your childhood, and all of our childhoods, which is this secret world that you have, away from your parents, in those quiet moments where you're discovering something that really matters to you. Those are the first moments you're becoming a person, really, when no one's telling you that you should like something or do something. You pick up a book on your own, or you're obsessed about, today with kids, it'll probably be some video game that they just go so far into, and it makes them interested in coding, or whatever it is. But that secret world of, a kid sort of discovering, oh, I like this, and I'm this kind of person, and this is me, and they build from there. And for me, it was, one of those first weird things that I had this, this story coincides with us moving into the housing projects. Prior to that, I really didn't have a room of my own. I lived with my mom, you know, with a bedroom, and I had like no personal space. So this thing where like we suddenly found ourselves in the housing projects, is as formidable as the housing projects are, what they did give you was personal space. And I had a room, was my own, that, at the age of 8, I could decorate with, a poster of Evel Knievel and a poster of Wolverine. And, I had a tiny little black and white television set, and I had my own bureau that I could arrange stuff on it. And, those memories are very, they're so much a part of the formation of your psyche. They're the first patterns, and just, the weird rituals you do as a kid, you don't even realize how much of them they expose about you. I wouldn't say I had OCD, but I definitely had bizarre notions of order that pleased me, and sort of like upkeeping these sneakers was part of that. It gave me like this thing that was like mine. I controlled it, and that was it. Today, sneakers are like religion. It's like off the charts. But back then, we were sort of one of the first generations to really sort of fetishize them as something other than, things you wore to gym class. And people thought we were crazy. I mean, people really just did. My uncles ridiculed me. Like the older kids who were just like a little bit older than us were like, "What are you doing? Those are sneakers. Like, why are why are they so important to you?" So, and it went on and on from there.
Okay, so this is for your story in the Shameless Feminist, which was the last issue on World War III before the one that come this year.
Yeah.
And well, there's a lot of things happening in this story. I recommend people to read it closely because there's a lot of things happening. I'm especially interested in one, mostly because I want to ask you about your voice in this, but there's a lot of things happening. There's some young girls that come into the bar, and there's the issue of smoking on one side, which I'm not gonna get too much into that because there's a lot of ways in that which that could be either done right or wrong. not on your side that people complaining about smoking. There's a
Sure.
lot of words in how they can do it and why. And there's also a conversation about sexual harassment, which turns pretty into people going into some new place they don't know, and everybody looking at them, and then it starts confusing, but it also showcases some problem in which how we look at these things sometimes, like policing. And then at the end of it, there's a part of it that touches me explicitly. I must say I cried with it. I spent big parts of this morning crying, which is like a conversation between Darlene, which is the bar owner, and Marta, which is a trans woman that is her friend and also friend of the characters. And well, there's a moment I like a lot. Is this one? Um, and there's some stuff. I generally like how things happen. I think you are showcasing a problem that happens with certain uh, old feminists that have certain fixed ideas that don't necessarily respond to what really happens in the world. And that's how it connected with me, which was Marta was going out of the bar saying, "I would never want you to be scared, Darlene. I would never want you to feel the way I feel when I'm in a men's room," which connected with some of my experience. And I had to read this like 4 times to read it now without responding emotionally. And so I felt it's a story a lot. Mm, I also had my problems with it, which I think it's fair because it's like a very complex story. You can't get these things done right because it's like there's a lot of evolving conversation about this, so it's difficult to do it right. But I have and one of the I have two problems, but more like two questions for you because it's not like I have a problem because it can be interpreted in different ways. One of the questions is about your voice in this, the off voice, the first person voice that is talking about not intervening. And I have had some of these situations in which I wish people intervene more, but at the same time, I don't think you're necessarily putting your voice as something right, just as something that reflects a voice. And the second thing is I usually don't get out of the situations with something as good as an apology and a hug, which is a way to end the story that I feel was calming and was, but also was a decision. Like that's not how these things always work, but it can pretty much work because these people know each other. So that makes sense in that context. And I just want to ask you about your voice here, the voice, the first person voice, and that decision of how to end this.
Yeah, I mean, this story, I went through about 25 drafts on it. And the first draft was very quote unquote right, right? I just had everyone I presented problems and solved them. And it became more apparent to me as I went on that I didn't have the right to do that for everybody in this story because these feelings are very raw. They're happening very much right now. Um, I had, originally cast Marta in this very much more sort of aggressive, in your face, like, she defends herself much more aggressively in the earlier drafts. And I thought it made more sense for her to do what unfortunately happens to a lot of trans people, which is they get tired. They get tired of fighting this fucking fight every day. And that's what, I thought that was a much more honest thing to reflect. And this story, you're supposed to have problems with it. So I'm glad you did. There would be something wrong with you, I think, if you didn't. I mean, this is a series of people not doing things the right way. It's a problem about personal politics and sort of larger academic politics and how they play out across generations. One of the big problems in it is these sort of, Gen, what we call now in marketing speak in the United States, Gen Z girls coming into this bar. And, what they want from the world is not wrong, you know. but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are older than them and maybe aren't as progressive should just disappear either. So that's kind of what's happening in this story, the sort of negotiation of spaces like this. And I didn't want to provide easy answers because I thought that was irresponsible. This conversation is still going on. And particularly with trans people, again, I have, just by virtue of my activism here in the city, have witnessed, just a baffling separation of them. I mean, just the fact that I'm saying them right there, like, tells you something, right? It's like, so really that resolution was really about Darlene seeing something that she wasn't allowing herself to see, which is they are both women because they are both in peril. And that's why that this issue that she has with the bathroom is an illegitimate issue. That's why she has to, and it all happens because Martha says to her, I would never, and Martha is saying that to her, Martha is saying that to her very knowingly because she does know. It's the same thing. They're under the same threat. You know what I mean? So that,
yes, I understand you.
if I'm, making my intentions clear here. So it was a tough story, and it was yet another one that I to give you the full story on the full Shameless Feminist issue, it started out with several editors, and it was important to me that it be an all-female staff. So I was not supposed to be an editor on that issue, but two of the women had to leave because they, had sort of outstanding commitments. So I got thrown into editing it, which I thought from a marketing perspective was problematic because I wanted to write the press release and be able to say, all female staff, And Sabrina, who's great, and is another one of the artists at World War III who's been a mentor to me. Sabrina Jones was like, well, your first name's Sandy. Maybe they won't notice. Don't worry about it. So I got suckered into editing it. And then I got, sort of not tricked into doing a piece, but, Isabella, who was one of the other editors, was like, you should do this story about these issues, you've always been talking about how, whether it's feminism, whether it's, issues around poverty, whether it's whatever, like there's always a class and sex thing running through that sort of shatters it, which has been sort of one of the undercurrents in my work. And then I wrote this nightmare, the story started off very neat and felt untrue. And that's why I had to, do that thing where I shattered it, where, I have one of the characters basically walk out on the story because I basically completed the story and I looked at it. And once again, these vignettes, to a very large degree, everything you see in the story actually happened. But presenting it in isolation, when you edit something for a story, you end up doing things that are not necessarily true. And I felt I had done something very terrible to that character, even though, again, factually, everything I had presented were the events. And then I sat back and said, what would she say to me if she read this? That's when I added those 2 pages after the fact. I tore out one of the frames and sort of bent it up so she can like walk out with it and, sort of have her moment where she, attacks, a lot of these arguments that are really based on feelings. And, it's not about necessarily trying to play all sides, but more making sure that everyone is heard. And then what people do with that with each other is really what matters. Darlene could have let Martha keep walking, but she doesn't. And that's really, the victory in this, for some sense of fairness in the world. And that's really what that story's about. But, it's supposed to be upsetting. I was upset when I wrote it, and it upsets me when I read it now because it's not a happy subject. We're talking about the unfairness that we commit against each other. What's happening to Martha isn't happening from the patriarchy. These are her friends. Her friends are doing this to her, And I didn't feel that I could soften that story and not show I did give Darlene some virulent language that my friend Diane would probably never say. She would never quite say it like that. But the fact of the matter is, the sentiment is the same. So I felt as just as I was being elaborate about some of the other politics, I had to be elaborate about the problem as well. And it's tough. You have to sort of risk being misunderstood. There's a lot of people who read this story and don't read till the end because they get so mad before they get to page 4 and they're like, what the fuck is this? And just lose their shit. And you have to literally, as with all my stories, frankly, my stories are comics, and I do characterize these people in this very cutesy, almost Disney way that's sort of related to graffiti and stuff. But that's to sucker the reader into reading it, frankly, because I don't write about easy stuff, and because I don't think easy stuff is all that interesting. I think that this is the stuff that if there's work that needs to be done in narratives right now, it's these types of things, the things we don't talk about. And this is among, again, ostensibly, I'm not trying to cause divisions or unnecessary arguments among progressives, because I think we're on the right road. But I think that we do a lot of harm when we pretend that things are more perfect than they are. And yeah, this story is like a bowl of spaghetti, frankly. But I reached a point where, that old saying that, artwork isn't completed, it's abandoned. This was abandoned after about 25 tries. But it's probably the only story where I finally just went, this is it. Like, this is all I can do without wrapping it up in a bow for somebody, which was never my intention. That's kind of how I started. I started with a very neat moral story, and I was just like, this is just that's not helpful to anybody. That's not, it's not helpful to me. I also write my stories for myself. I write them with an audience in mind, but if they're not interesting to me, I'm not going to do them. It's too labor intensive,
I loved your response. I wasn't expecting any. I was just throwing that. So I loved that, and I agree that the end is very calming, very like fair end, which doesn't always happen in your stories, because sometimes they don't have a fair end, and I love that. And also it makes me think that it's also a great story to have right now, because a lot of these things are radicalizing more, and I would love to see more stories in the future of World War III with trans women writing or doing things actively, especially as this other position, which is not the one that Darlene has. It's the one that Darlene is related to, but it's not the one she has. It starts to get more radicalized and more, more conservative, because it's conservative position disguised as leftist.
Yeah, I think that a problem in all politics is that we always have a contingent among us in any group where they just go, just tell me the answer. Tell me what's the right thing to say. And that's a problem. That's happening a lot in race politics here in the United States, where people will just go, okay, we just won't say this word anymore. Like, that solves something. It doesn't solve anything. It may spare someone's feelings, but we end up in bizarre situations like Walter Mosley, who's an African-American writer of some great repute here in the United States. He's written a lot of detective stories. He was on the staff of Star Trek Discovery, the new series that's on CBS, which is fantastic. It's produced by Brian Fuller, who's a really groundbreaking.
I'm watching it also.
Fantastic show, right? It continues the legacy of
beautiful
the series in a way that I think the intervening shows probably didn't. But he got into trouble because he used the word nigger in a conversation about race. He's a black man. He got into trouble with the staff. Like, he can't even bring up that word in talking about a race problem. That's insane. But that's kind of the weird, people, so desperate. And I get it. I get the impulse. It's unnerving to talk about these things. But again, if there's any sort of moral to this story, it's that these horrible interactions and conversations almost have to happen, because if they don't, they lead to worse things. You know, if they don't reach this point, my only regret is that it didn't really wrap up the generational stuff. I kind of have the young girls just get really pissed, and they just get the fuck out. They don't get to put up their poster, and they split. And that was just, I just ran out of space and time, and this story drove me. And again, I don't think I've ever written as many drafts for anything that I did for this. I mean, I went somewhere like on 25 distinctly different drafts, and the story didn't work until the very last one, when I added those 2 pages where the character walks out, where she's like, I'm not going to be, she basically rebels at being used as a device in the story, which I think is something political as well, right? She's an imaginary person, but to some degree, she should have some integrity and agency as well, which she does not have. And she basically walks out, just basically telling me to go fuck myself, which she should. And to some degree, I treated her unfairly in this story, but, I felt like if she could say something, that's probably what she would say. That would probably be her complaint about what I wrote about her.
Okay, so we got another commentary or question, more like a comment, which was asking, and I think it's interesting with all these characters rebelling against you and everything, if you like, I don't know if the translation of the book, but since we both know Spanish, Niebla de Unamuno.
No la conozco. ¿Qué es lo que significa?
It's a Niebla, it's a novel by Unamuno, by Miguel de Unamuno, which does the same. The characters rebel against the author.
Oh, okay.
And someone recommended it.
Okay, I'll check it out. I don't know it. No. I thought you were saying like a colloquialism to me, like a phrase.
Oh. Yeah. No, it was like a book, like this book Niebla. I don't know how it's translated to English, but
I'll look it up. That's what Google is great for.
So we got a recommendation.
Wonderful.
And okay, so the next, I was gonna connect this very fragment of the end about social commentary and all the stuff in more realistic ways with both the story of Beyond the Lighted case, which was more about the feelings of one character than any other thing. But I think it was, I don't know how to explain it, but like a powerful thing of what use do you have for anger and resentment and things being unfair in the world, which I think connects with the story from the last issue of World War III. Those 2 things remind me of, of anger and resentment and things that you can have in an unfair world, or where people do things that are not fair. And that's, I leave you to that to explore in whatever those 2 things.
Yeah, I mean, and Beyond the Lighted Cage, I mean, I was trying to, I went through a period of great frustration and anger. I grew up in a part of the world where death came early. I lost a few friends. I've lost many more since. But those first, I think for those of us who grew up in places like the Bronx, it's interesting when you're sort of in your early adolescence, you think you're somehow prepared because you've encountered death early. But what happens is, there's a very big difference between losing a friend when you're 12 and losing a friend when you're 22. It's just, it's so much worse. I can't even describe it. You lose someone like that, and it's like a country you can't go to anymore because you have these memories with this person, and now you're the only holder of those memories. And for me, the character who's killed in this story, that part of it is very factual. He was a Colombian kid named Lelis Alfredo Gonzalez, who he was the eldest of 3 boys. We grew up together. and he kind of didn't get to have a childhood. He was the oldest of us, and I wasn't even part of the family. He had to sort of like watch all three of us. He had to like babysit us and sort of walk us around everywhere. So he sort of grew up early and was very much his own man, and sort of like struck out on his own very early on. And through, just very random circumstances, he was driving a cab one night and was attacked by two of his fares, and they stabbed him to death in just a very grievously, violent, horrible way. He died terribly. I mean, and it, a few of us who are friends of his, just sort of during that period, even in your early 20s, you're not sure how things are affecting you. I don't know if, frankly, as human beings, we ever know in the moment. But, for my part, I became extremely, extremely aggressive. And one of the ways I was able to channel it, fortunate for me, was that I wound up in this relationship with this gym. I was a welder at the time while I was in college, and they gave me some lessons in exchange for fixing their gate because they couldn't pay me, and it worked out, great. But once I was in there, it was like a whole constellation of aggression sort of started to bubble up. And those gyms, when they're run right, are places where actually violence is actually dissipated. Even though you're in the rink, punching with someone, you've agreed to a certain set of rules, a certain engagement. And it's not about aggression. It's not about anger. It's not actually about trying to hurt the other person. It's about trying to outperform them. But I was in there with all this turbulence in my head. And that time with those guys, seeing how they handled their aggression, how they handled their physicality as men, helped me understand what was wrong with me at the time, and the fact that I really needed to sit down and really think about what had happened. I think, like a lot of young men, I just decided that not thinking about it was the best way to handle it. And as with anything, you can say you're done with something, but if it's still in your head, it's going to manifest. If you don't deal with it emotionally, you're going to manifest it physically or in some other way. So that's really what that story was about. That's, definitely one of the more personal stories in there. With regards to God Bless the Americans, it's really just about how, how race is just so underneath everything. And even someone who's, a well-meaning person, it's like he's got certain blinders on. Like, he can see one part of the racism in the world, but he kind of doesn't understand how voting for Trump was a really terrible, shitty thing to do. He sort of has made this deal with himself that, well, I was just voting with him on the basis of economics, which I was explaining to you before we got on this Zoom call is ridiculous, because Trump was a horrible businessman anyway. So, that story had a lot of that sort of wrapped in it. That story was me also just trying to understand, like, how much of, we can blame Trump for whatever, but we made him president collectively. So there is something still wrong with this country, whether it's our, the procedures of our governments or ourselves, as people. It's maybe a little bit of all of those things. Maybe it's our system, but, we create our system as well. We agree to it. So we have to be responsible for its effects. And one of its effects was this guy. So all of those things, sort of matter. And it was me trying to unpack that, and, again, I try to be as forthcoming about my place in the context, even though I've fictionalized myself as a character and I've fictionalized these people. So, I don't consider myself someone who holds on to any sort of racist ethics. But the fact of the matter is, I've always listened to, stand-up comedians or watched, animation like Family Guy that, in really callous humor, And you can make whatever excuses for it you want in the end. But, there's an old saying, that like every joke is funny and not funny to somebody. It's someone's going to laugh at it and someone's not. Um, and, the story's a bit about that too, that we kind of make excuses for the things that entertain us or the things that we just want to hold on to for whatever infantile reasons. And it's only when one of those people is in the room that we really have to think about, wow, maybe, this isn't that funny, you know? And that's, that's sort of what the story within the story with his recollection with his wife, that's actually the part of the story that's really sort of most made up. I did have a boss who had an Asian wife, but I had to sort of sit there and imagine how they might have met and all that. And I know that, the racism against her was something that had always bothered him, but I had to sort of come up with this whole, I just don't know him well enough for him to have told me all of that. So I had to sit there and create this parable. And really, it's fictive, but it's things I've seen happen. It's, I've had friends who are Asian who people just assume they don't speak English for some stupid reason. And it's like, why would you do that? Just because they're the only Asian person sitting here, you have this completely alien, perception of them, and it's whatever, So it's all of those things. So, but the things around it, sort of the arguments leading up to, are conversations I've heard and conversations I've been a part of, and that was sort of my way of sort of laying that stuff out and trying to speak to what I think is wrong in the country right now, or what needs more work. Again, we got rid of this guy, supposedly. We'll see.
Yes, like 3 hours ago.
he's going to be dragged out kicking and screaming. I mean, literally. But the problems that created him or that enabled him are still here. We keep acting like that's going out with him. It's not. Like, those weird crypto-fascist groups are still here. And we have to find out how do we deal with that. It may be that we can't. That's why I don't provide an answer in the story. It may be that we just have to have better laws and better regulations, and those people can have their weird feelings, but as long as they can't hurt anybody, let them stay the hell over there. That's been a big part of the sort of laws in New York with regards to race and LGBTQ rights. You can't control the way people think, but if you can stop them from not hiring somebody on the basis of that, and you can create penalties, that's a better society, and eventually we'll have to come around on the other stuff. But at least if you can make everybody's life livable, that's the thing we have to do. That's the thing we owe each other in a society. So.
I think for all the, humorous or satire the stories are, that idea shows in your stories of trying to make it better. When the situation ends better, it's like it ended better, and when it doesn't end better, I as a reader feel like it should end better, and I question myself, how would I make it better? Because that's how I approach. I don't know if that's the approach you want, but that's the approach I have.
I want people to have their own questions, and I don't want them to feel. I mean, again, I read plenty of things that provide those answers. Some of them are done very well. Some of them are very eloquent. Some of them, frankly, you may as well have not read them because you already have those feelings, or you know what I mean? And to me, it's more like I get to point out, again, most of my characters don't do the right thing, at least not in the beginning. And I think that's a much more honest way to tell stories about life, because I'm already doing something remarkably artificial, which is telling you a story that begins and ends. Life doesn't do that. It just goes on, with no rhythm or, moment of recognition and cathartic turn in the plot. Life doesn't do that. But to the extent that I have to engage in that artificiality, the more I can sort of, dialogue is a really important thing. I'd spend a lot of my time really listening closely to the people in my life and why they're saying what they're saying. And if that's what's probably benefited my writing more than anything else. I do read the work of, a lot of my peers, and I'm my, you can't see it, but my halls are just lined with, comic books, and novels. But ultimately, those things just sort of give you great experiences and show you how someone else does it. They're not going to tell you how you have to tell the story that you have to tell. And I honestly, my only misgiving about no, I have plenty of misgivings, but my central misgiving about the story I did in Shameless Feminist is that it probably should have been 3 stories. There was a lot. It was like every time you turn the page, it's like, and now these people are fighting, and now these people don't get along, and frankly, that's kind of how it feels here in New York sometimes. Like every corner you turn, there's some other argument about something either important or not so important or incredibly important, and you have to sit there and go, "Oh my God, what is this? Is this going to be a 2-minute conversation, or is this going to drag on for days, or is this nonsense?" And there you have it. I've never been so happy to be done with a story than I was with that one. It was very tough. So.
Well, for closing the interview, well, for starters, you talk about all those comics you have that we are not seeing, and if you want to say some of your favorite stuff that you have been reading recently.
I went back and read Preacher again, which is really excellent. 100 Bullets by Brian Azzarello. I started to reread one of the. Well, I'm working on a couple of projects right now. I'm editing a graphic novel called Let's Bet the Planet about climate change denial. It's sort of like Joyce Farmer is the editor who brought me on. So I'm trying to sort of read stuff that sort of are disparate anthologies that are kind of like just nutty, like everything thrown in together to sort of give me a counterexample about what we should be doing. So I've just been sort of ordering some random stuff off of Amazon that I haven't gotten to yet. But I will say by far, one of the things I return to most often is Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's run on Daredevil, which I think is now collected as Born Again. I have the actual issues, but it's a 12 or 14 issue run they did where they basically take Daredevil back to the beginning, but it's, Mazzucchelli's art in it is he has such contempt for the human body, like he'll like when he draws Batman, like he'll draw like a roll of fat on Batman's back, when he's like leaning over to grab something. So he's like not like the super fit Batman that we all see. He's got kind of like round shoulders. And that to me is a much more interesting way to sort of picture these guys as not so quite so superhuman. But that story is just such a fascinating exercise in sort of form. And, they're ostensibly telling something that's very, very almost like pulp noir-ish, but they have these sort of very classic Marvel intrusions, like the Avengers appear in one issue for a couple of panels. But the way they bring them into this story, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this run of stories.
Yes.
They're very much pictured at a remove, which is the way Daredevil would see them. Thor is just this shadow on the top of a building, and he makes it rain. And Iron Man just looks like this robot. Like he's just not friendly at all. Basically threatens him to release this criminal that they're taking back on government authority. Like just the divisions in it are just so. It also has, bar none, the best characterization of J. Jonah Jameson ever done in comics, which is a single page where he berates the reporter Ben Urich for being too afraid to continue with the story. And it's the first time you ever see J. Jonah Jameson in a positive light. And they don't even identify him. He's in the dark. You just kind of know him by the shape of his head because of that square haircut he has. And it's a marvelous defense of journalism in this one page. where he basically tells this reporter, you know, this isn't the first time a reporter's begged me to get on a story and then quit because of a few broken fingers. And he rolls up the newspaper and he points it at him and he says, this is the most powerful weapon in the world. It's a newspaper. It's deposed kings, it's impeached presidents, and it's been waiting to get aimed at the kingpin for a long time. And then it's just a couple of panels of silence, and J. Jonah Jameson says, you're lucky I don't fire you, get out of my office. And then you realize, like, oh, this is where Spider-Man works. Like, this is the Daily Bugle. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's little things like that, you know, within that genre, because you have so many expectations. They were able to, and this is now, what year was that? That was 1984, maybe, when that came out. They were able to play with your expectations so well. So it's one of the works I definitely return to, because it navigates the sort of mainstream conventions of comics at the time, but does something very original with it. So that's what I think.
It's kind of funny to me that you recommend that one, because I haven't read that much long ago, but I had like that full reading all the Daredevil stuff. And with what I really bring close to my heart was actually when Ann Nocenti started writing. That was what's really what I remember well. So it's funny because it's like they run after that, just like after that.
It's bananas, yeah. I mean that was one of those comics that had no right at the time when I was a young reader. You had no expectations of it being any good. It was the thing you bought if you had a little money left over. And when Frank Miller had returned to it, I was like, oh, I'll check it out. And David Mazzucchelli, I had never seen his artwork before at all. And it was so unglamorous, like just, you know, very well drawn, very great draftsmanship, wonderful anatomy, wonderful architectonics, but not at all, you know, my favorite artists of the period were people like George Perez, you know, Mobius, you know, people who were draftsmen par excellence. And like Mazzucchelli still to this day is not that. He's great in this completely other different way. And that's liberating, you know, because you can just see this guy was a fan of Edward Hopper and certain paintings. And he's really just about light, form, and sort of drawing clothes as they are, you know, with all their wrinkles and all of that. And you know, I still find great inspiration in just the sequencing those guys do. You know, they that stuff is terribly cinematic, you know, just the way they lead you scene to scene to scene to scene. You know, the pauses between the panels in those stories speak eloquently, you know, almost as much as the dialogue. And it's great.
I need to read it. Oh, okay, so when I asked you this you were talking about the anthology Let's Be the Planet that you are editing, and I want to know if you have any other news, any other new project that you're getting into, etc., that you want to talk with us, or more about the things that we can expect soon.
Yeah, Let's Be the Planet is something we hope to have out in the spring, I think. It's going to be full color. And again, it's climate change denial, so it's kind of a weird, you know, it's not just climate change. We're trying to sort of undermine the people who say it's not happening. So I'm doing a story for it that is about all the cryptid animals. So it's like Bigfoot and Sasquatch and the Loch Ness Monster. And they're all sort of watching the Weather Channel as though it was a soccer game. And they're placing bets that the oceans are going to rise because there'll be no humans. The rest of us will be gone. So everyone's doing very different stories for it. There's some interesting stuff coming together. You'll see some of the usual World War III illustrated folks in there, and some really interesting people who've been in comics for a very long time, like Leonard Reifus and other people like that. And Joyce Farmer herself is doing a story for it. She did one of the seminal feminist comic anthologies, maybe the first of its type, back in 1971, called Tits and Clits. And it's like an infamous, fun, crazy, raucous anthology. One of her later works more recent works is Special Exits, which I definitely recommend people check out. Speaking of things I'm reading right now, she gave me the Spanish edition and the English language edition and asked me if I would look at them to see if the translation is terribly off. So I'm reading that right now as well. That and I'm really sort of in the middle of that and another project that I started developing years ago called Johnny Next, which is about basically this magician on the Lower East Side here in New York who wakes up one morning after this cataclysm and everyone in the world has superpowers except him. And the way he survives in this future world is by convincing people that he has superpowers when he has none. He's just a magician. My childhood friend Michael Mejias is writing the script, and we're sort of on the beginnings of it right now. So I'll send you info on that as it comes. We're literally penciling. He's giving me pages as we go, and it's also being pitched as a television show right now as well. So that's what's going on. But we don't know what's going to happen. We're probably going to have to finish the graphic novel first in order to go through this.
For someone to see it and decide if they wanna do a TV show.
Yeah, it's a little abstract. Like you read comics, so the tropes I just explained to you in that pitch, like popped immediately, right? But you say that to someone, who's in a studio, and they're like, "What? Like, I don't understand." So like, does he have powers or doesn't? He's like, "No, he's a magician." And they're like, "But magic is kind of a power." It's like, no, it's really not. Like, this guy just does things with whatever. And it's just once you start having that conversation, the pitch is over. And you say, "Nice meeting you," and you walk out and try not to embarrass yourself. We pitched it to Brian Fuller, and he turned it down. So, I still like Star Trek Discovery, so whatever. I'm still a fan. I still like Hannibal. I still like everything else he's done. But he did say no to us, so we'll see next time.
He lost it. So
I think he doesn't want to do animation. Not that I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but he did. If you ever get a chance to check this out, he produced right before he did Hannibal, maybe a few years before that Hannibal series with Mads Mikkelsen. He did an animated pilot for Amazing Screw-On Head, the Mike Mignola comic book. It was a 45-minute pilot with David Hyde Pierce, Molly Shannon, like a lot of sort of TV stars in it. Great vocal cast, Patton Oswalt. And it actually was one of the first animations I've seen that looked like Mike Mignola's Hellboy work, like heavy black ink, and it was amazing. And it didn't get picked up as a TV show, so I think he doesn't like animation anymore. So that's maybe why we didn't. Maybe that's why we didn't get that far with him.
Okay, so to close this interview, which I hope you all enjoyed, thank you for the comments which were left by Irene and Angeles. I forgot to give them names. I was just saying somebody commented. But these were Irene and Angeles, and and we're gonna have Sandy back for the Mutant What's So on December for one of those. Yes, it's gonna be exciting. As you all have seen, he has a lot to say about Marvel stuff, as it has been solving this. So it's gonna be a great deal of social commentary on the X-Men, which I'm really excited about. And well, for all of his future projects, when we get that collection of your works, we're gonna announce it and move it around and etc. So people be attentive to the website if you like what you saw here. And thank you everyone for coming to watch and for leaving some comments, and hope you all enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Sandy, for coming. It was a great experience interview for real.
Well, it was an absolute honor, and thank you for the questions. I hope I answered them well, and I can't wait to talk X-Men with you guys, because normally, even in this world of gigantic conventions, generally you start to get into the weeds and talk with, they just walk away from you. So it'll be nice to be among sort of like-minded people talking about that stuff. It's great.
I'm sure we're gonna have fun. Everyone be attentive to that.